Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we have to talk about Google because Google apparently misled all of us about their location data collection practices. Now, this is coming from a really good write-up in TechCrunch, and here's what's going on. Unfortunately, this is still persistent in some ways, but hear me out here. Now, this is what's up. Google has been sanctioned $60 million in Australia, so 60 million Aussie, which is roughly 40 million US here, over its Android settings that it had applied dating back around 5 years, which were found in a 2021 court ruling to have misled consumers about its location data collection. Australia leading the charge on this one, but Australia obviously not alone. Now, Australia's Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC, instigated proceedings against Google and its Australian subsidiary back in October of 2019, going on to take Google to court basically for misleading representations to consumers about the collection and use of their personal location data on Android phones between January of 2017 through December of 2018. Now, in 2021, an April court filing, Google had breached Australia's consumer law when it represented to some Android users that the quote-unquote location history setting was the only Google account setting affecting whether it collected, kept, and used personally identifiable data about your location. But in actuality, another setting called Web and App Activity also enabled Google to grab Android users' location data, and this basically was turned on by default, and there you go. That's why the ACCC in Australia had a big problem. So you're going to that location history setting, you're saying, don't track my setting or don't track my location, but the Web and App Activity was also tracking your location on by default, and they really weren't being descriptive about that. So in other words, they were using what we call a dark pattern, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, per the ACCC, Google took steps to correct this, the contravening conduct, as you will, by basically the 20th of December 2018, meaning that consumers in the country were no longer shown specifically these misleading screens. That's obviously being in Australia. No indication if that happened here, but we'll get to that as well. Now, at the time of that court ruling last year, Google said that it had disagreed with the findings and was considering an appeal, but apparently they decided to simply just take the verdict. So let's talk about dark patterns that Google was using to confuse us about our privacy. And for the record, Google is not the only one that is giving us headaches with things like dark patterns. So here's what Google did. The ACCC's press release included some screenshots basically showing Google notifications to Android users that the court found to be misleading, which includes 3 versions of Google's web and activity settings screen shown to consumers setting up a Google account on their device that do not mention the word location at all. Instead, one of these screens, which appeared between April 30th of 2018 through December 19th of 2018, Google instructs consumers that the setting, quote, saves your searches, Chrome browsing history, and activity from sites and apps that use Google services, end quote, before basically nudging them to retain a pre-selection option to, quote, save my web and activity to my Google account, also known as opt-in to Google's tracking. It also suggested, quote, this gives you better search results, suggestions, and personalization across Google services. But nowhere does it explain that the user is actually agreeing to have their location tracked. If Android users tried to turn this off, by going to location history, i.e. Via a totally separate setting that did not actually enable them to prevent Google's location tracking, they could also be shown a confusing pop-up querying their decision to, quote, pause location history, end quote, as Google put it, basically warning them that the decision would, quote unquote, limit functionality of some Google products over time. So basically they're saying, are you really sure you want to do this? You might be limiting your functionality. Now, it's hard to know what even the point of that was, since the setting did not actually empower consumers to entirely prevent Google from snooping on their location. So probably it was most likely there to basically spread FUD, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Now, the text in this notification concludes with a further confusing line, telling the user to, and I quote, remember, pausing this setting doesn't delete any previous activity, and pointing to them yet to more settings where Google suggests they could, quote, view and manage this information in your location history map. Now, this was presumably intended to send some down basically a pointless rabbit hole while drawing their attention away from from the web and activity setting where Google had hidden other location tracking settings. Now, other versions of web and activity settings, which the court found misleading for Android users between early 2017 through late 2018, included one which included 5 full possible actions that a user could take. A plethora of choice obviously intended to confuse them to leaving the on setting as basically on, since it obviously drastically is unclear what any of the other available on-screen options really were and what they did. Now, there is actually a ton of other examples here that TechCrunch did use, but you get the idea of what they're saying. Essentially, dark patterns are there to confuse us or downright trick us by doing something that we won't want to do or make us think we need to keep something on or else we can lose functionality. Meaning, you're over here tracking all of our data, you're not telling us that, but you're giving us this big shiny thing over here on the other side that says turn this off to basically stop tracking, and here they are tracking you on the other side. That is deceptive. These are indeed deceptive practices, and it stinks that we have to take all of these big tech data collecting companies like Google to court to get these things fixed. Again, they are not the only offender of this, but given that they are one of the largest data miners and platforms on the planet, they're obviously a huge target, and so doing them affects potentially billions of their users. So you may also think that this is basically in Google's past, since this was a few years ago in Australia and it was just adjudicated. The wheels of justice in democracies turns slowly, but Google is actually facing an ongoing investigation into the same practices in the European Union that was opened since February of 2020, where it could basically be on the hook for a more sizable fine than Australia if it's found to have infringed on the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation. If you didn't know, penalties of the GDPR can scale up to 4% of global annual turnover, meaning if Google is making tens of billions of dollars, they're going to get 4% of that for violating privacy laws. That's a good chunk of money. That is billions. Now, consumer watchdogs in the EU actually filed complaints about Google's deceptive location practices tracking back to November of 2018. So basically, we're talking about Google here. Google will still be able basically to claim that it's moved on, whatever the outcome of that one. Now, a draft decision by Ireland's Data Protection Agency, which is leading this investigation, is expected this year, although the final decision probably won't be reached until 2023, since it must be reviewed essentially by the Blocks network of DPAs, meaning the other data protection agencies in other countries in the EU. An agreement has to be reached on enforcement. But there's interestingly more about Google here, because earlier this summer, European Consumer Rights Group filed a new series of complaints against Google, accusing Google of deceptive design around the account creation process that they say steers users into agreeing to extensive and invasive processing of their data, meaning they are confusing you when you are signing up for accounts and you're opting into things that you didn't think you were. Now, the complaints highlight how many more quote-unquote clicks are required by Google to let users opt out of its tracking, which are basically a ton and obviously confusing according to these complaints. So once again, the EU is leading the way here on consumer privacy for the world, although Australia obviously is no slouch. Now, EU lawmakers also recently agreed to include a ban on online platforms, any online platforms designing or deploying deceptive or manipulative and or confusing interfaces in their forthcoming flagship update, essentially to the rulebook for GDPR, meaning these things will essentially get companies like Google banned if they continue to do it. That is a good thing. Deceptive practices are a huge problem. If you're thinking about it this way, Facebook, on the other side of this, used to have a end user license agreement that was something like 80,000 words long. Nobody was reading it. They've spelled out and buried things in like subsection ZZZ 248, kind of thing. And so they had to shut that down after basically being accused of the same thing. Lawsuits were filed, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a huge problem. Understand how difficult it is to maintain your privacy when they are literally trying to deceive you on how to maintain your privacy. This is the problem we face. I hope more people are aware of this, so please feel free to share this video, because most people don't realize just how deep the data mining rabbit hole goes. And there you are. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please continue to stay private. Thanks, everyone.